The wall fell down flat. That is the image almost everyone carries into Jericho. Priests, ram's horns, dust, and a city wall collapsing before Israel enters the land. But the most famous wall at Jericho is not Joshua's wall. The stone tower in the schoolbook photograph is Neolithic. It was built in the 9th or 8th millennium before Christ. That is about 7,000 years before Joshua's traditional setting. And it may not have been a military wall at all. Archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef argued that it likely protected the settlement from floods, mudflows, and erosion. This is about asking a better question. Which wall? Which century? What does the text say? What did the trench uncover? This is not a test of belief. It is a test of whether we handle evidence honestly.
The book of Joshua opens with a charge. Be strong and of a good courage. That is Scripture. It is the text's voice. The text brings Israel to the Jordan. It says the river overflowed its banks at harvest. It says the waters rose very far from the city Adam. It says 12 stones were set at Gilgal as a memorial. Then the story moves to Jericho. Before the city falls, 2 spies enter it. Rahab hides them beneath stalks of flax on her roof. She lets them down through a window by a cord because, the text says, her house was upon the town wall. The text does not explain the city's archaeological period. That is the excavation's question. The scarlet cord and Rahab are textual evidence. No excavated house bears her name. We will not pretend otherwise. Joshua chapter 6 describes 7 priests and 7 trumpets of ram's horns. It describes the ark, 7 days, a final shout, and a wall falling flat. It says the city was burned. It says certain metals went into the Lord's treasury. It says Rahab and her household were spared. Archaeology cannot excavate a shout or a procession. It can test a place, a wall, a destruction layer, and a date. Our rule is simple. First, what the text says. Then, what was excavated.
Then what scholars infer. And when we speak of God's purpose, we will call it theological interpretation. Joshua names Adam beside Zairatan as the place where the waters rose. That is a geographical claim in the text. At the Jordan's Damia Reach, north of Jericho, bank collapse can block the river. It is a documented natural mechanism. An earthquake can destabilize a steep bank. Earth and rock can constrict the channel, raising upstream water while the downstream bed runs low. The year was 1927. On July 11th, a magnitude 6.2 earthquake struck the region. Seismologists debate the precise epicentral location. Records report that the Jordan's flow near the Damia Bridge ceased for about 21.5 hours. A United States Geological Survey catalog records other landslide dams north of Damia. The documented years are 1267 and 1546. The catalog also lists 1906 and 1927. It does not list 1160, 1534, or 1834. The geological evidence shows that the river can stop in this reach. It does not show that Joshua chapter 3 happened on one of those dates. The evidence cannot recover the timing. It cannot tell us whether God intervened. A natural mechanism is not a theological verdict. The claim that God timed it for Israel belongs to faith. The trench and riverbank cannot measure it. That distinction will matter even more when we reach the walls. Jericho is not one city frozen in time. It is a tell, a mound built from cities stacked over cities. Deposits reach back to roughly 10,500 before Christ. UNESCO describes 29 occupation phases in one of Kathleen Kenyon's trenches. The Neolithic tower has an internal staircase of 22 steps. It is not evidence for Joshua's battle.
By the Middle Bronze Age, Jericho had formidable defenses. Excavation director Lorenzo Nigro describes 4 fortification systems from that sequence. One included a stone retaining wall, an earthen rampart, and mud brick defenses. The Cyclopean wall stood about 8 meters high and enclosed the spring. The retaining wall stood roughly 4 to 5 meters high. The upper mud brick wall was about 2 meters thick and 6 to 8 meters high. The crest stood far above the outside ground.
The layers reflect generations of repair, rebuilding, and response to danger. A wall must be dated before it enters the argument. This was not a metropolis. Estimates vary because scholars count different parts of the fortification belt. The upper town may have covered roughly 6 to 9 acres. With defenses included, the figure can approach 17.
It was a fortress town, small but strongly defended. Ask which wall, which phase, which date.
In the 19th century, Charles Warren identified Tel es-Sultan as biblical Jericho.
Later excavators uncovered walls, burned ruins, grain, and a complicated sequence. John Garstang excavated here from 1930 to 1936. He concluded that the city's destruction happened about 1400 before Christ. He connected it to Joshua. His expedition had the explicit goal of demonstrating the reliability of Joshua's account. That does not erase his fieldwork, but it requires us to distinguish data from interpretation. He found a real walled city, fire, and collapsed brick, but his key Joshua double wall did not survive later dating. A date can transform an object's meaning. A wall from the wrong millennium cannot demonstrate an event in the right story. Kathleen Kenyon returned from 1952 to 1958. Her method was meticulous. She read pottery in carefully controlled sections. Her conclusion was decisive for Garstang's central identification. The town walls he had assigned to Joshua belonged to the early Bronze Age, almost 2,000 years earlier. Kenyon dated the Great City 4 destruction to about 1550 before Christ. She associated it with an Egyptian campaign against the Hyksos, an association criticized as an assumption rather than an independent clock. Her redating still changed the discussion. Kenyon also saw a gap in settlement evidence between about 1560 and 1400 before Christ. This was the turning point. The famous conquest date no longer matched the wall Garstang had used.
The argument did not end with Kenyon. Bryant Wood re-examined the published evidence in 1990. He argued that City 4 should return to about 1400 before Christ. His case rested on 4 pillars: pottery, stratigraphy, scarabs, and radiocarbon. Wood argued that the pottery had been dated too early, challenged Kenyon's stratigraphic reading, and treated scarabs as support. He also cited a charcoal date reported as 1410 before Christ, plus or minus 40 years.
Wood's case is a minority position. He edited Bible and Spade for Associates for Biblical Research, an apologetics ministry. He has also identified himself as a young earth creationist. That does not answer the pottery question. It identifies his framework.
Wood deserves to be heard in his own terms. His argument is specific and testable. Most archaeologists working on Jericho's chronology do not accept it. Piotr Bienkowski answered Wood point by point. He argued that Wood overlooked published evidence, including late Bronze II Cypriot imports found at Jericho. He concluded that Wood's case did not withstand scrutiny. This is a scholarly dispute, not a contest between belief and unbelief. It concerns how the evidence should be weighed. Wood published a rebuttal. The evidence base for this film does not establish that it won any of those specific points, so we will not declare a winner by volume. Now a different kind of witness. A physical clock inside the grain.
Radiocarbon dating does not read the Bible or pottery styles. It measures carbon found inside organic material. Brouwens and Van der Plicht tested grain and charcoal from Kenyon's City 4 destruction material.
The weighted average for the grain was 3,306, plus or minus 7 radiocarbon years before present. The method has limits. Samples can be old wood, calibration and context matter, but grain from a destruction level is direct evidence. When calibrated, the grain results fell within the late 17th and 16th centuries before Christ. The researchers said the fortified Bronze Age city was not destroyed about 1400 before Christ, as Wood had suggested. This is the strongest single constraint in the debate. A dramatic wall image cannot settle the date. One correction must be made plainly. Wood's often cited charcoal date of 1410 before Christ, plus or minus 40 years, was later remeasured. The revised result was 3,300 plus or minus 110 radiocarbon years before present. The date that seemed to say 1400 moved. It cannot confirm a 1400 conquest. Calibration curves have been revised. An Intercal 20 recalibration still places the series in 16th century ranges. Nigro dates the destruction between 1550 and 1520 calibrated before Christ. Even Titus Kennedy, who argues for a 1400 position, concedes that radiocarbon currently rules out a destruction around 1230, but has not resolved the broader dispute.
That is a fair place to pause. Where both sides agree, a walled Canaanite city stood at Jericho. The city was violently destroyed.
It burned. Mud brick collapsed. Grain remained in storage jars. At the base of the stone revetment on the west, Kenyon found fallen red brick piled nearly to its top. The brick is excavated fact. Calling the slope a ramp is interpretation. It may be a useful description, but it is not a separate structure recovered intact. Some excavators read the outward collapse as evidence consistent with an earthquake. That remains an inference. Kenyon herself refused to call it established fact. Garstang and Kenyon both found large quantities of burned grain in jars. Kenyon reported 6 bushels in one season.
Charred grain was there. That is excavated fact. Full jars can fit a short siege, but other explanations remain possible. That is inference. Joshua places the crossing at harvest.
Stored grain fits that setting, but the soil does not give us a harvest date. That is textual alignment. It is too strong to say that Late Bronze Jericho did not exist at all. Nigro reports Late Bronze occupation on a reduced scale. A mud brick wall was added along the crest of the surviving Middle Bronze Cyclopean wall. There was a smaller building, Amenhotep III signet rings, and an administrative cuneiform tablet. So Late Bronze Jericho existed. What is not established is a large fortified city destroyed around 1400 before Christ.
The trench cannot tell us that 7 priests marched here, that ram's horn sounded, or that the ark passed before the people. Silence in the soil is not proof that the text is false. It is a limit on what the soil can answer. No dated earthquake has been matched to a conquest-era destruction at Jericho. Do not borrow the strong earthquake of about 2700 before Christ. That belongs to a different destruction, a different city, and a different world. Kenyon proposed an earthquake as a possibility. Then she called it a conjecture. That is the standard we should keep. The majority archaeological position is that no great fortified city stood at Jericho in 1400 before Christ. Many scholars also regard Joshua's conquest narrative primarily as a later theological composition rather than straightforward campaign history. That view must be heard. But archaeology does not decide every kind of truth a text can carry. Theological interpretation begins where the text claims God's action, judgment, mercy, and covenant. Archaeology can test material settings. It cannot excavate divine intention. Rahab's final legacy is carried by the text, not by a named house in a trench.
Joshua says Rahab and her father's household were saved alive. Matthew chapter 1 verse 5 says, And Salmon begat Boaz of Rechab, and Boaz begat Obed of Ruth, and Obed begat Jesse,
Rahab's name passes from Jericho into a genealogy that leads toward Christ. That is a textual and theological legacy. Archaeology does not identify her person. Jericho was the first city across the river. The text says what waited beyond it was bigger. Next time, giants of Canaan and what the archaeology actually says. Faith comes by hearing. History comes by evidence.